Under the shadow of twin suns, the battlefield stretched across the valley like a wound in the earth. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and the faint tang of ozone from discharged energy weapons. Human and alien forces had clashed. For weeks, each side claiming victory in small bursts, yet neither surrendering. Today was different. Today the war came to the edge of something far stranger than politics or land. The human soldier named Kale moved silently among the wreckage. His dark armor battered and streaked with dust. His pulse was steady despite the chaos around him. He had survived ambushes, orbital bombardments, and close combat with the best the alien forces could send. But when the forest mist shifted, revealing a tall figure with hair the color of deep ocean light, Kale's instincts told him this fight would be unlike any other. She wasn't just another warrior, her very stance commanded the space around her. Her name was Lysera, warlord and daughter of the alien High Council. Her armor glinted with silver filigree, but her eyes held the sharpness of a blade. She stepped forward, her sword humming with a strange energy that made the air ripple. Around them, both human and alien soldiers fell silent, watching. Without raising her voice, she declared the terms of their meeting. If he lost this duel, he would serve her as a slave until death. If he won, he would become her husband, bound by their ancient laws. There was no room for refusal. Kale's grip tightened on his weapon, but it wasn't fear that ran through him, it was something else. The challenge was public, irreversible, and binding. The alien crowd whispered among themselves, the humans muttering in disbelief. Marriage was not the kind of prize anyone expected in the middle of war. Yet the way Lysera's eyes held his made him wonder if this was about more than just victory. The forest wind shifted again, scattering ashen leaves between them. Lysera's lips curved in the faintest smirk, her confidence unshaken. Kale studied her movements, noting the balance of her stance, the subtle readiness in her fingers. She was testing him before the fight even began. And he, for reasons he could not name, found himself testing her in return. It wasn't just a duel, it was a conversation in steel and fire before a single blow had been struck. The soldiers on both sides formed a wide circle. There would be no interference. This was tradition older than either army, and breaking it would invite dishonor. The two combatants stepped closer, blades angled but not yet crossing. The sound of their breathing was almost louder than the distant crackle of fires. Kale spoke first, his voice calm but edged with challenge. "And if I refuse both outcomes?" Lysera's smile deepened as she replied that refusal meant immediate death. The choice, she said, was not whether to play but only how to win. A single bird cried from the tree line, breaking the tension for a heartbeat. Kale thought of the soldiers who had fought beside him, the cause he had sworn to defend, and the strange possibility that stood before him. Victory meant becoming part of an alien world he barely understood. Defeat meant chains. Yet there was something in Lysera's gaze that was not cruelty, but curiosity, like she was weighing the man as much as the warrior. The signal to begin came from neither side, but from the very silence that fell between them. Blades rose, muscles tightened. The first step each of them took was measured, precise, and deliberate. The war around them felt distant, almost unreal, as if this fight had swallowed the entire valley. Kale felt the familiar rush of combat readiness, but underneath it, a question burned in his mind. Why had she chosen him for this challenge? And what did she truly want from its outcome? The crowd's murmur faded into the background as Kale circled Lysera. Each step was deliberate, their eyes locked like two predators testing the other's limits. Her sword gleamed under the fractured sunlight, the golden runes along its edge pulsing faintly. Kale kept his blade steady, his body angled to counter her reach. She was taller, faster, but he had fought against worse odds before. The moment demanded not just strength, but patience. Lysera lunged first, her sword cutting through the air with a hiss. Kale shifted his weight, and let the strike pass close enough to feel the heat of its energy along his cheek. He countered with a quick slash meant to test her guard rather than harm. She parried easily, the ringing clash echoing across the silent battlefield. Both knew that the first true blow would decide more than just the duel, it would decide which world claimed the other. They moved like dancers through the clearing, each feint and strike carrying intention. Lysera's footwork was flawless, each step pressing Kale closer to the circle's edge. But Kale had learned in the trenches of Earth's wars that retreat could be a weapon. He let her think she was driving him back, then pivoted sharply, reversing their positions. Now it was her heel grazing the boundary line as his blade pressed near her side. Her eyes narrowed, but her smirk never faded. With a sudden twist, she disengaged, forcing him to follow her into the open space again. Every movement was a conversation, every blow an unspoken question. She was measuring him, and he could feel her doing it. Kale realized she was not fighting for mere dominance, she was searching for something in him. Though what that was he could not yet name. A sudden burst of speed from her forced him to block high, the shock running down his arm. She pressed harder, her sword humming louder as its runes glowed brighter. Kale stepped into the attack rather than away, their blades locking in a contest of raw strength. For a moment, their faces were inches apart, breath mingling, eyes burning with unspoken challenge. Around them, the watching soldiers leaned forward, sensing the duel nearing a critical turn. With a surge of force, Lysera broke the lock and spun, her weapon arcing toward his unguarded flank. Kale dropped low, his own blade sweeping upward in a counter meant to disarm rather than wound. The clang of impact rang like a bell, and Lysera's sword wavered but did not fall. Instead, she pulled back and adjusted her stance, acknowledging silently that he had forced her to reconsider her rhythm. The duel slowed for a heartbeat, both fighters reassessing. Sweat traced the edge of Kale's jaw, though his eyes remained sharp. Lysera's breathing was steady, her poise unshaken. Yet her gaze had softened in a way that unsettled him. This was not the gaze of someone who saw an enemy. It was the gaze of someone recognizing an equal. That recognition was more dangerous than her blade, because it made him hesitate. The hesitation lasted a fraction of a second, but Lysera saw it. She closed the distance in one smooth motion, her sword tip grazing the plate of his chest armor. Kale froze, feeling the faint heat where the energy edge met the metal. Yet instead of pressing the advantage, she held it there, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "You fight like someone who has already chosen their fate," she said, and for the first time, he wondered if the choice was truly his to make. Kale stepped back, the faint glow from her blade still lingering in his vision. His heart pounded against the inside of his armor, but his breathing remained calm. Around them, the circle of soldiers tightened as if drawn by an unseen force. Lysera did not lower her sword, her stance still sharp, yet her eyes studied him with a weight that made him uneasy. This was more than a duel. It was a judgment. He tightened his grip and launched forward, aiming a strike toward her midsection. She deflected it with a swift turn of her wrist, the sound of metal and energy clashing echoing between the trees. Sparks scattered in the air, briefly lighting their faces. The rhythm between them was shifting again, each step and movement pulling them deeper into a contest that felt less about winning and more about understanding one another. Lysera feinted left, then spun right, her blade a blur of glowing steel. Kale barely blocked in time, feeling the vibration through his arms. Her speed was unnatural, each motion almost too fluid for the eye to follow. Yet he saw openings, small and fleeting, and used them to keep her from overwhelming him. She seemed to welcome these counterstrikes, her lips curving faintly every time he forced her to adjust. The fight became faster, their movements blurring in the eyes of the onlookers. Energy crackled between the blades, each collision sending waves of heat through the air. Kale felt his muscles straining, but his focus stayed locked on her eyes. They no longer held just challenge, they held something deeper, an emotion he could not name. Whatever it was, it fueled her as much as it drove him. With a sudden shift, Kale drove her back several steps, their blades locked in a tight bind. The sound of straining metal and energy filled the air. For a heartbeat, their foreheads almost touched, both refusing to yield. Lysera's breath came warm against his cheek, her voice low but steady as she asked why he fought so fiercely when defeat could mean life instead of death. His answer was simple: he did not fight to avoid death, but to decide how he would live. Her eyes widened slightly at his words, but she pushed harder, forcing him to step aside. They broke apart, circling each other once more. The watching soldiers had grown completely silent, their anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Kale adjusted his grip, the weight of his sword familiar yet alive in his hands. Lysera's expression shifted, no longer a smirk but something far more unreadable. She struck again, this time with precision meant to end the duel. Her blade arced toward his chest, but Kale pivoted, letting it pass as he stepped inside her. Guard! His own sword came to rest just beneath her chin, close enough to make her pause. For a moment, neither moved. The heat of battle seemed to dissolve into a charged stillness, where victory and surrender existed in the same breath. Slowly, Lysera lowered her weapon. The alien crowd stirred, confused by the lack of a decisive blow. She studied him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Her voice, when it came, was soft but carried across the clearing. "Perhaps," she said, "you are not meant to be my slave after all." The way she looked at him then made Kale wonder if becoming her husband might be the greater challenge. The moment hung between them like a drawn bow. Kale kept his sword steady, though his pulse was a drumbeat in his ears. Lysera's gaze held his without wavering, and in that stillness the battlefield seemed far away. Around them, both armies shifted uncertainly, unsure whether the duel had truly ended. Kale could feel the weight of every watching eye, but it was her unspoken question that kept him frozen. Lysera stepped back, the glow of her blade fading as she sheathed it with deliberate grace. Her movements were slow, measured, as though testing how far he would let her retreat. Kale lowered his weapon, though he kept his stance ready. She tilted her head slightly, studying him like a rare artifact, her expression unreadable. "You understand now," she said quietly, and he realized she was not talking about the fight. He answered with a steady voice, telling her that he understood she was more than just a commander. There was strategy behind her challenge, a purpose, hidden in the ritual. Lysera gave no verbal confirmation, but her eyes shifted in a way that told him he was right. It was not about winning or losing. It was about seeing who he truly was when the choice was stripped down to survival or surrender. A soldier from her ranks stepped forward, perhaps to protest the unfinished duel, but Lysera silenced them with a single raised hand. Her authority was absolute, and the alien warrior stepped back without another word. Kale noticed the respect in their movements, the way her people looked at her not just as a leader, but as something closer to a living symbol. That kind of loyalty was not born from fear alone. Lysera turned away, motioning for him to follow. Without thinking, Kale did, though his instincts told him to keep his guard up. They walked beyond the edge of the circle, the sounds of the watching armies fading into the distance. The forest air was cooler here, the light filtering through high branches casting patterns across the ground. She stopped beneath a great tree, whose roots wound deep into the earth like coiled serpents. She spoke of a prophecy, one Kale had never heard of. It told of a foreign warrior who would stand against her and force her to see herself through another's eyes. This warrior, if victorious, would not just win her hand but alter the path of her people forever. Kale listened, unsure whether to believe such a tale, yet the weight in her voice told him she believed it completely. Her challenge had been no random act, it had been destiny in her eyes. Kale asked her what she truly wanted from him, now that the duel had ended without defeat. Lysera's expression softened, though her words remained careful. She said she wanted to know if he could lead beside her, not as a subject but as an equal. The idea struck him harder than any blow she had landed in the fight. He had come here as a soldier, not as a man who might change the future of two worlds. For the first time since their blades crossed, Kale felt the tension in his chest ease. He realized that the war between their people might hinge on what happened in the moments to come. Lysera's eyes, fierce yet searching, waited for his answer. And as the wind stirred the leaves above them, Kale understood that whatever he chose now would bind him to her fate as surely as any vow. Kale stood beneath the towering tree, the filtered light casting shifting shadows across his face. The weight of Lysera's words pressed against his thoughts, forcing him to confront possibilities he had never considered. She was asking for more than a truce, more than an alliance. She was asking him to step into a role that could reshape the destiny of two warring civilizations. The quiet between them felt heavier than the clash of their blades had moments ago. Lysera's posture was as regal as it had been on the battlefield, but there was something in her eyes now that had not been there before. It was not softness exactly, but a quiet intensity, as if she were seeing him in a way no one else had. She asked him what his world had taught him about loyalty, and Kale told her that loyalty was forged in hardship, not in comfort. Her gaze did not waver, and the corner of her lips lifted slightly, almost in approval. They began walking deeper into the forest, their pace unhurried. The sounds of the battlefront were far behind them, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of alien birds. Kale asked why she had not simply taken him as a prisoner if all she wanted was an equal at her side. Lysera's answer was measured. She said an equal cannot be taken, only chosen. It was the choice, not the duel, that would decide their future. Her words stirred something in him, a mix of defiance and curiosity. He had fought wars to defend his people, to protect what was his, but never to bind his fate to someone else's vision. Yet here she was, offering him a place beside her as if it were not a burden, but an honor. He wondered if this was what true diplomacy looked like: negotiation fought not with words, but with steel. They stopped by a small stream, its water glinting under the light. Lysera knelt and touched the surface, letting the ripples spread. She told him that in her culture, water was a symbol of oaths. To drink from the same stream as another was to share a bond that could not be broken. Without looking at him, she dipped a carved metal cup into the water and held it out. The meaning was clear, and the gesture carried more weight than any treaty. Kale took the cup, the cool metal biting against his palm. He looked into the clear water, seeing both their reflections distorted by the ripples. Slowly, he raised it to his lips, the taste crisp and pure. Lysera drank after him, her eyes never leaving his. Around them, the forest seemed to still, as if the very air recognized the bond being formed. The silence was not empty, it was full of expectation. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. She told him that the council would never accept a human at her side without resistance. Some would call it betrayal, others a threat to their traditions. But she believed strength came from change, and change required risk. Kale listened, knowing she was right, yet also aware that such risks often came with a cost neither of them could yet see. He met her gaze, the determination in his eyes matching her own. Whatever came next, it would not be simple. They would have to fight, not against each other, but against those who refused to see beyond the war. And in that moment, Kale knew that the duel they had fought was only the first step in a battle far greater than either of them had imagined. The path back toward the battlefield was quiet, yet it felt nothing like the silence they had left behind. Kale walked beside Lysera, his mind turning over the weight of the decision he had made at the stream. He had not spoken the words aloud, yet the act itself had bound him to her cause. The forest lights shifted over her armor as they moved, each glint a reminder of who she was, not just a warrior, but a leader prepared to risk her position for what she believed in. When they reached the edge of the trees, the two armies were still locked in a tense standoff. The soldiers' eyes followed them, curiosity and suspicion mixing in their expressions. Lysera stepped forward first, her presence alone parting the crowd of alien warriors. Kale stayed at her side, feeling the weight of every gaze. They had not seen the fight end, but they could see the change in the air between the two of them. Lysera raised her hand for silence, her voice carrying effortlessly across the gathered troops. She announced that the duel was concluded, and that by the laws of her people, the victor would stand at her side. Her phrasing left no doubt she had named Kale as her equal, not her prisoner. A ripple of unrest moved through the ranks, but none dared speak against her in that moment. The human soldiers looked at Kale with disbelief, unsure whether to see him as a comrade or as something entirely different. Kale did not speak at first. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes scanning the alien ranks. He told them that he had not come to enslave or be enslaved, but to fight for an end to the war that had claimed too many lives on both sides. His words were met with a mix of silence and murmurs, yet he could see that some among them were listening. Not all were ready to lay down arms, but the possibility had been planted. The Alien Council's envoys emerged from the far side of the clearing, their robes flowing and faces marked with disapproval. They demanded an explanation from Lysera, speaking in clipped tones about the dishonor of binding herself to an enemy. Lysera met their words with unshaken calm, telling them that honor was not found in holding to old hatreds, but in forging a future where their people could survive without endless bloodshed. Her voice carried the weight of command, and though their eyes burned, they did not interrupt her again. Kale stood beside her through it all, saying nothing until one envoy turned to him directly. They asked if he truly believed a human and an alien could lead together without one trying to dominate the other. Kale's reply was simple: strength was not in ruling over another, but in standing beside them when the harder road was the only one worth walking. His answer did not change every mind in that clearing, but it left no one doubting his resolve. The tension broke only when Lysera extended her hand to him in full view of both armies. Kale took it without hesitation, the gesture sealing what their duel and shared drink had begun. Around them, the forest breeze carried the faint scent of smoke from the still burning front lines, but the fires of war seemed somehow less inevitable than they had an hour before. In that clasped hand, there was not just an alliance, but the first fragile step toward peace. As the armies began to withdraw under her orders, Kale felt the enormity of what lay ahead. There would be battles to fight, both on the field and in the hearts of those unwilling to change. Yet he also knew that the bond forged here was stronger than the steel they had crossed. The war was not over, but the path forward had been set, and they would walk it together, bound by choice and by challenge. The days that followed were unlike anything Kale had experienced in his years as a soldier. Instead of orders barked across a war camp, there were councils filled with tense, measured voices. Lysera kept him close at every meeting, not as a decoration or symbol, but as someone whose opinion she valued. The alien leaders studied him carefully, some with open hostility, others with cautious curiosity. Every word spoken felt like it could shift the fragile balance they were trying to build. Kale found himself learning her culture faster than he had expected. Their customs, their unspoken rules, the way they placed weight on honor above convenience, none of it was simple, yet it made sense in its own way. Lysera watched him adapt, her approval subtle but unmistakable. She explained that winning the duel had not been the greatest challenge. Proving he could live among them without breaking their ways would be far harder. He took her words not as a warning, but as a promise of what was to come. At night, They would walk the quiet halls of her stronghold, speaking of things that went beyond war. She asked him about Earth, its oceans and forests, its storms and stars. In return, she spoke of her people's history, the battles they had fought not just against enemies, but against themselves. There was a strange peace in those moments, as though the weight of the battlefield could not reach them there. Yet even in that calm, they both knew the storm had not truly passed. One evening, a messenger arrived with news from the front. A faction within her own forces had refused to acknowledge Kale as her equal. They had fortified a position near the border and declared that they would not follow a leader who had bound herself to a human. Lysera's expression hardened, but there was no fear in her eyes. She told Kale that they would go to them together. Not with an army, but with words strong enough to cut through steel. Their journey took them across the vast plains under the pale light of the twin moons. Kale felt the eyes of scouts on them from the shadows, though none approached openly. Lysera moved with the confidence of someone who knew every step of this land, and Kale matched her pace without question. He could sense that this meeting would decide more than whether the rebels stood down. It would decide if their alliance could survive. Its first true test, when they reached the rebel encampment, a wall of armored warriors blocked their path. Their leader stepped forward, a towering figure with a voice like distant thunder. He accused Lysera of betraying their bloodline and accused Kale of being nothing more than a chain around her neck. Kale did not answer at once. He let the words hang in the cold night air, meeting the eyes of each warrior before he finally spoke. He told them that their war had already cost them more than they could afford to lose, and that if they truly believed strength came only from blood, they had already doomed themselves. Lysera stood beside him without interruption, letting his words fall like hammer blows. The silence that followed was long and sharp, broken only when the rebel leader lowered his gaze. No surrender was spoken aloud, but the wall of warriors stepped aside, granting them passage. As they left the camp, Lysera glanced at him with something between pride and relief. She said nothing, but he could see the shift in her eyes, the recognition that this fight, like their duel, had been about far more than winning or losing. It had been about proving that they could stand together in the face of those who would see them divided, and that, perhaps, was the truest victory of all. The morning sun rose over the capital city, casting golden light across the alien towers. Kale stood beside Lysera on the balcony of the council chamber, looking out over a city that had once been a distant enemy's stronghold. Now it was the heart of their shared rule, though the scars of war still marked its streets. The air carried the hum of industry and the distant voices of people slowly adjusting to a new era. It felt fragile, yet alive. Inside the council hall, the final assembly gathered to seal their alliance. Representatives from both species filled the chamber, their eyes sharp with caution and expectation. Kale could feel the weight of centuries of distrust pressing into the moment. Lysera spoke first, her voice steady as she declared that the war was over, not by surrender, but by the binding of two leaders who had once stood on opposite sides of the battlefield. Her words carried not just authority, but conviction. When it was Kale's turn to speak, he did not deliver the speech he had prepared. Instead, he spoke from the truth of their journey, the duel that had begun it, the oaths made by the stream, and the moments when they had faced defiance together. He told them that trust was not born in an instant, but forged in trials that demanded sacrifice from both sides. There was no illusion that peace would be easy, but there was now a path where before there had been only blood. The council members murmured among themselves, some in approval, others still wary. Yet one by one, they rose to place their seal upon the treaty. The sound of each stamp echoed through the chamber like the toll of a bell, marking the end of one age and the start of another. Lysera's eyes met his across the table, and for a heartbeat, it felt as though the chamber was empty but for the two of them. That evening, the celebrations filled the streets. Fires burned in great stone braziers, and music rose from every corner of the city. Kale walked through the crowd beside Lysera, accepting nods from soldiers who had once been his enemies. The people's eyes still held questions, but there was a spark of hope now where before there had been only suspicion. It was a beginning, and beginnings, Kale knew, were the hardest victories to win. Later, in the quiet of the palace gardens, they spoke alone for the first time since the treaty was signed. Lysera asked if he had any regrets, and Kale shook his head. He told her that the fight had been worth every risk, because it had led to this moment. She admitted that when she had first challenged him, she had expected either a slave or a corpse, not a partner who could change the course of her life. The honesty between them was sharper than any blade. They stood beneath the same tree where she had told him of the prophecy. This time, there was no tension in the air, only the calm certainty of a choice already made. Lysera reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. The bond they had formed had been tested by war, by politics, and by those who would have seen them torn apart. Yet it had endured, and in enduring, it had become unbreakable. As night fell, the twin moons rose above the city, their lights silvering the rooftops and streets. Kale looked out over the world that was now as much his as it was hers. They had begun as enemies locked in a fight for dominance, but had ended as allies bound by respect and choice. Whatever came in the years ahead, they would face it together. Not as conqueror and conquered, but as husband and wife,